decisions in the state legislature.
So how can we make science the standard instead of just random policy?
But it's more than just how the legislature or government treats science. I mean, some of this is how the whole approach and the investment that the state makes in education. I mean, if you take education as a social good, as a value, that's one thing. But if you look for it just in terms of cost-benefit analysis, it's a problem. And I don't think we respect science enough from a governmental level. We don't respect education enough from a governmental level. And that's a fundamental problem. If you're anti-education, it's not surprising that people are anti-science.
But don't you think going back to my but going back to my original point where I was thinking, well, gosh, do I say that Ethan's like a Harvard honors stud or not?
They made a mistake. They make mistakes there. Don't worry.
But I'm looking at this and I think, I'm hearing you say that, but the governmental lack of respect for education or science, I think, comes from the voters, because that's who they elect. They find, like I said, the guy that makes them feel normal or the woman that makes them feel less dramaed out, and that's who they vote for. Steve, do you want to grab that one?
Well, I think it's just, it's always been a problem. I think that people don't like to be civically engaged. I think we're entering a time where people are going to have to pay a little bit more attention than they have. I think we saw that in the last presidential election. I think that was a real battle. Many people that had never been politically engaged before suddenly realized they better be. And I think that will continue. I'm not with you that a red state is going to get painted blue, but I do think that people are getting more realistic about the kind of people they want to have in office. Of course, you've got to get the people to run too. That's a big thing. I mean, I remember when Ethan ran, I didn't give him much of a chance. Just the name alone, he did it.
Right, Rick?
Yeah, when did smart become uncool?
Yeah.
I think smart's pretty cool. And I think a lot of people believe that as well. And I think you mentioned this term development and the confusion that surrounds that. I think part of the problem is the way we measure development and progress, and this consumer-led, production-driven GDP measuring, stealing from the future and liquidating in the present economy that government people seem to value so much in industry, is really not the way to measure our happiness and our contentment and our progress as a society. I mean, Bhutan, a tiny little country over in the Himalayas, they don't measure cash transfers hardly at all to measure how their country is doing. They do something called the gross national happiness.
Oh, yeah.
And they use, so what about our gross state happiness? And in their measurement, they only use equity.
We need Prozac.
Equity, well, Prozac may work. Equity, governance, environment, and culture are the four things that they measure. Nothing about cash transfers. And so if we're looking at our economics as simply as the amount of dollars that change hands, we're fundamentally deceiving ourselves. Those are the same people that looked at the Exxon Valdez oil spill and said this is a good thing because Exxon had to pay $2 billion for a cleanup. And look at all the money that changed hands. It's an absurd thinking.
Right.
So at any rate, and using, smart is cool. It's okay to have smart politicians. Thank you, Ethan.
Yes.
I mean, he brought some real dignity, I think, to the Alaska legislature.
I agree, and I would say this, that when smart became uncool, stupid became sexy.
Yeah.
And that's a problem.
Wait a second.
That's a real problem.
I think I resent that remark too.
I think smart is the new sexy.
No, but I want to say, I think it's important, smart isn't just about IQ points. Smart is about the intellectual curiosity that people have around the world around them. Smart is the rigor that you bring to analyzing problems and not just accepting things at face value. And I don't think that's necessarily a reflection of how well your neurons are firing and how your synaptic gaps work. It's a question of how curious you are about the world around you, and that can be anybody. And it should be everybody.
We gotta get synaptic gaps going along with swagger. We'll have it.
Maybe we have synaptic swagger.
Swagger, there you go.
Yeah.
Who was
There's
it that
the
once
Dorona.
said something about some of the dumbest people I know have PhD degrees, and some of the smartest people don't even know what one is. And there are a lot of indigenous people throughout the world that aren't really, totally engaged in academia the way, a number of us have been, but have wisdom beyond years.
Well, we saw it with the Yukon River salmon thing, where Fish and Game, I can't tell you how many different ways they blew management of Yukon River salmon. First off, because they didn't know how to count the fish. I remember some years ago, do you remember the pilot point counter was pointed into the mud and they didn't realize it?
That they were missing a fish.
Yeah, and what had happened basically is that politics had changed, and the guy that really knew how the thing worked was gone, and this new guy pretended he knew how it worked. And so they miscounted the fish. And the people up the river, they knew all along, but they were too polite, Then we got in a situation where there's something wrong with the salmon at sea now. Okay, so the Yukon River is a very long river. And so for 3 years, they mismanage it so bad that the Canadian side doesn't get enough fish. Fish and Game Department does this.
Right.
And then all of a sudden, it's the 3rd year of the treaty. They have to get all these fish, and we only got this year to do it. So they shut down subsistence and everything. And the people that lived on the Yukon River had to sit there and put up with that.
Yeah, and some of them actually went and poached.
Oh, yeah.
And did that, and of course they got their allotment up the river because they knew the fish were there. And when I talk to people outside of Alaska and try to explain the Yukon River and the management there, I'm like, if you took that river out and pulled it out straight, it would go from LA to DC. It would cut the continent in half. We are not talking about your grandpa's fishing bank in Nebraska for crying
it's an
out loud.
incredible place.
We're talking about this huge, amazing thing, and seeing how that was manipulated and that science that really affected people's lives.
We didn't do the science. We didn't do the research. I mean, if we were dependent solely on one fish counter at the mouth of the Yukon, that's not rigorous science. I mean, that just isn't rigorous.
We could certainly do better on that. The other problem with science and public policy in Alaska, of course, is the co-option of science and government by powerful industrial interests. I think everybody here is very, very aware of what's gone on in Alaska over the past few years. And what's illegal doesn't bother me as much as what's legal and just passes right under the radar for the public. The campaign finance issues and the huge amounts of money that gets donated to the university, what that buys. These are not just philanthropic donations.
Right.
These are investments by the companies. They want something in return for these things. And for anybody that thinks that industrially sponsored science gives objective answers, well, they just simply need to think again, because there's a vast body of literature that demonstrates that, where the funding comes from matters a great deal in the results. And the best example of that is the Exxon Valdez science. The government science, $400 million, demonstrated the extensive severity of the damage. Exxon science showed, guess what? No damage here.
It's even better now.
It's even better. We hope
They
that
love
place.
it.
And so there's no better example of how industry can buy the answers they're looking for.
Well, yeah.
So we have to be very careful about that.
You could just let your parents grade your SATs.
There
I mean,
you
it's like, obviously they're going to be seeing your answers. Well, I know what he meant.
Well.
That's kind of, yeah, that's sort of all right. I mean,
Sure.
but having, and the colonization of Alaska.
Yeah.
I mean, it's very easy to come here and buy an election. Alaska, I think, more than any other state, needs that sort of hands-off.
Yeah.
But it comes to who we want to be. I mean, it's always the question that Alaskans have, is who do we want to be?
I want to be an astronaut.
Well, then you better go study some science.
I know, it's hard work.
It is hard work. And,
Trigonometry.
Okay, so you're running for governor. Who do you want us to be?
I want us to be independent, self-reliant people, and you need to be educated about the environment you live in order to be independent and self-reliant. It's as simple as that.
Well, people in Anchorage, though, we are so Anchorage-centric.
Yeah.
We really are.
But there's a whole state out here besides Anchorage.
I
know you've
this
heard
is-
about that.
Having lived out there in the other part, in actual Alaska. No, it's weird because I don't think people in Anchorage, which is the majority of the voting populace is here, I don't think that they realize where everything comes from. I mean, they turn on their lights, they turn on their water, and they've got, all the things that they need. And
But it's
people-
not just the state's wealth that comes from rural Alaska, it's the state's identity that comes from rural Alaska.
Yeah.